Dayglo in Necropolis. There was a meadow once, tucked within the woods, where wildflowers flecked the tall, wet grass and a plum tree stood amongst the foxglove. A place that had no name, and there was no sound except for the birds, and maybe the wind, and sometimes a stream which appeared only with rain. A place where in the night all was lost, and in the sun the world was young again. It was beneath this tree there was a child once. Some evening in August, when all the plums now littered the earth and smelled of wine the longer they spoiled, he sat there amongst the fallen fruit in the lingering dampness from the morning rain, where off in the grass the blackbirds and swallows ate from the soil, and the clouds of eye-gnats swirled like dust in the orange evening light. The boy studied these creatures, those fat little birds and all their music, those fluttering bugs, weightless and incandescent, the way they caught the sun, plucked from the air and the mud and the weeds. And the naked branches swayed gently above him, and the flowers danced in the wind, and the distant tree line encircled it all. That dark wall of evergreens, or 1,000 blackened spires that had been bled of all its warmth and all its light, ebbing with the sun. The child looked out across that black and brooding place, then to the birds again, those funny little balls that bounced at his feet, that cackled in the grass. And he managed to smile, for here was a world that was far removed, alien to his, a peculiar harmony encapsulated within that crawling rim of outer darkness. A moment he had forgotten why he was there, and the sun sank lower, and the dark inched closer, and the birds picked from the plums and danced in the mud, fifing their words, singing out in their language that was older than song. In these hills the dog days were gone, and there was a coldness now that clung to the meadow floor. The child shivered but did not move. He kept beneath the tree just as he was told, tucking his knees up within his big yellow raincoat for what little warmth his frail frame could muster. At his side, the sad bouquet of foxglove and daylilies he'd picked lay limp and muddy, and in his coat pocket was a little stuffed elephant that smelled of mold and was the color of mold too. He pulled it out and turned it in his hands. It was missing its trunk and an eye, and wisps of stuffing spilled from the tears. He sniffed it and spat, and tucked it away again, lying his head back against the tree and watching the sky. There was a plane up there, silent and shining. The child waved, and he hoped there was someone up there who could see him. And he hoped that they were waving too. And just as the meadow had begun to dim, and the birds had faded to little shadows, indiscernible from the plums until they'd move again, the clap of the gunshot rolled out from the woods and down through the grass, stealing it all. The sound he had forgotten he was waiting for. The child jumped in the suddenness, and the birds flew on. And just as the plane had gone, so did the sun, the last of its light reddening the sky in its dying glow. The boy stood before it in awe of the sight. The yonder place. Before his big brown eyes, the blueness of heaven smeared with the blood of that who had crossed. Or the price of admission he knew it to be. He could see the birds out there peppered among it, specks to it much like he was. And so he watched them as they swam, up and off and gone for good, the music taken with them. Soon everything had been touched by night, and the harmony was gone. The child now standing in a cold and shapeless dark, where out from the black the stars now blinked, as if 100 sets of eyes were awakened by the sound. And from the trees came no sign nor movement, no word nor call, just a hum from the wind and a gurgle from the stream that snaked unseen in the grass. The boy felt like running, but he stayed just as he was told. And for too long a time it felt, with none for company but that stinking elephant he held to his chest, and with none for comfort but its terrible smell. He sat and rose again, kicking at the plums, slapping at the mosquitoes that drank from his legs, those pale little things, even in the dark. And just as he'd decided to hightail it out of there, drawing his path out with a finger across the grass and into the woods where the trail was waiting to lead him down from the hills and out to the road, there it was. The faintest little glow. Way up on the hill, the warm bloom of the lantern swinging gently through the trees. Against the light he could see his breath, and soon the figure that followed behind it. The man trudged out from the woods and down to the field, the grass parting in his path. In the light, the boy could see the blanket bundled in his arms, the outer corners dragging along the weeds. There was a limpness to it. The child shivered, but not from the cold, and the welts down his legs itched aflame, but he did not move. his eyes transfixed upon the light and the shadow that carried it forth, the bugs swarming its shine, each dancing flower illuminated then gone again. The man tripped across the stream and cussed and rose and moved on, towards the tree and the child beneath it, until both of their faces were yellow in the lantern glow. The child looked up at his father. He down at his boy. "Let me see her," said the child. The man shook his head. "Please." The man shook his head and carried the blanket on past the child and on past the tree and into the tall and tangled grass again. The boy followed sullenly, eaten by the weeds, hanging onto his father's coat hem for guidance. The hole had been made in a small mud clearing before a fallen maple trunk. The dug-out grave dirt piled at the upturned roots and the shovel left from the day before sticking upright from the soil. The clearing had a sweetness to the air, a different sweetness. The smell of old wet wood and new wet earth, a kind of rot that smelled alive. The man dropped the lantern in the mud and walked near the hole with the body. The child stood behind with his flowers. "Can I see her now?" "No." In the wind, the grass blew wild around them. The man squatted on his heels, setting the swaddled body in the mud beside the hole. The blanket, once a powder blue, now black and heavy from the wetness. The man stayed squatted a while, catching his breath, and the child watched him hunched before the body in the gloom like some feeding beast reminiscent of the storybooks. The boy could see this pistol tucked in his waistband at the small of his back, the lantern light mirrored in its frame. This was the first time he had ever heard a gunshot, and it didn't sound much at all like the ones in the westerns. There was a brutality to it, a cold indifference, as if it were death himself who had clapped his hands. The man fished a pack of cigarettes from deep within his coat and coughed and hawked and spat it aside, the noises that came from him sounding older than he. He slid the stick out in his teeth and turned his face to the light and the child beside it and shook his head. The boy didn't understand at what he gave this gesture, if it was at him or himself or at everything at all, but the boy shook his head in agreement. The man sucked the ember down to the filter and spat on it till it hissed and dimmed and tucked the butt into the breast pocket of his army coat right beneath the name of a man he'd never known, and he rose and stretched and spat down the front of himself and rubbed it in with the cuff of his sleeve. "Come," he said, "let's get her buried." The boy pulled the shovel from the mud and stood at the hole opposite his father. His father nodded. The boy nodded back. The man then squatted again and scooped the blanket up into his arms, his legs tired and trembling, and his hands placed meticulously along the hem to keep the blanket from unraveling. But the ground was slick beneath his boots, and from the forward weight he had lost his footing and slipped onto his knees, struggling the body aloft before him, the weight all too awkward and all too heavy for his outstretched arms. He let it go, and so the two of them watched as the body rolled free of its pole, where it tumbled out to the mud and into the grave. The old girl lay there, limp and warm. The child could smell the blood. Through his nose he could taste it, like he was sucking on a coin. Her eyes were closed and her tongue hung dry twixt her teeth. The man rose slowly, the blanket in his hands. He looked at his boy. The boy looked down at his dog, at the hole atop her head between her ears, at her brindle coat streaked white with age and the white streaked with red, at her old pink collar now as faded as she. Beneath the blood she looked like she was sleeping. The child waited for the flick of a paw, but there was nothing else to dream. The man tried speaking to his boy, but his words were hushed by the wind. The wail of it. The child wailed too, those tiny howls no different than his dog's in the days preceding, while she lay in her bed paralyzed from the waist down and with no control of her bladder. It had happened suddenly in the night, and she screamed in the confusion of it all. And for those 3 terrible days the child never left her side until the hole was dug and his father said it was time. They fixed her a stake in the morning, and when the rain had cleared, they packed the truck and made for the hills. 12 days of rain and the sun had come. They parked along the side of some old dirt road where the only tracks for many miles were that of the trucks from the day before. The boy stood outside the cab in a puddle of rain to the ankles of his rain boots, petting the girl who still lay inside. The water had filled his boot from a tear in the seam, and his foot grew numb from the cold, but he stayed with his girl, stroking her ears and speaking to her in his sweet little whispers. Out in the road, the man was crouched in a plume of smoke over the child's little red wagon, where he made out a bed for the dog with bedsheets and couch cushions. He had his back to the child, and in the smoke the child could see nothing else but the back of his second-hand army coat and his pale, hairy arse that hung from his jeans, shelved upon his heels. He finished and stood, and pulled up his pants, and wiped the cherry from his cigarette against the sole of his boot, and coughed and spat, and together they wrapped the girl in her blanket, and laid her in the wagon, along with a lantern and a jug of water and a can of beans, and then they set off for the trail, the man tugging her along while the boy followed behind. At the end of the road was an old yellow gate that had rusted off its posts. The man carried it aside and laid it down in a thicket of brambles, and the metal signage that adorned the trees, now illegible from all the years and all the rain and all the holes of assorted caliber. They made from the road and onto the trail up through the great stand of cottonwoods, where atop the dampened duff they moved almost soundless if it wasn't for the creak of a wheel and the squeak of the boy's cold, wet boot and a cough here and there, and sometimes a sneeze, and all around them the dampness glittered, and from the rain the world smelled reborn. The child kept behind the wagon, following carefully within the tracks it left pressed into the leaves, and the softened pine straw like the outline of a sidewalk or some perilous footbridge that hung high above the earth, now and then looking down along the edge and trying to imagine what it would feel like to fall all that way, and what it would look like to splat there on that very sidewalk that was outlined before him. The man had started to slow a bit, but kept at his paces, while that old girl lay bundled between them. She was quiet here, and during this time not once did she howl, nor did she whine, nor did she whimper. In fact, she looked like she was smiling, her head poking from the blanket like an old woman with her headscarf and her face pointed at the sun tangled up within the trees, where the squirrels chittered and a raven croaked. Way up, where the light slipped down so that all around her it hung in threads, and the shade was streaked with gold, her naked face savoring each naked sunbeam that passed upon it, and her eyes closing in the warmth. The boy watched her and smiled, stepping out from within the wagon tracks and falling to his doom at the sight of her happy, that little stuffed elephant tucked at her side. And on they sauntered up the hills and through the trees and down the old lost logging roads that spat them out from the shade and into the sun, where all before them nothing glittered and nothing sung, and nothing waited but the smell of nothing like the smell of life. Only sawdust. All these years and still just sawdust. To the boy it was like splinters in his nose, like wet wood chips in a schoolyard. The child could smell that place, Miss Finity and her whistle, Mr. Byron and his cancer, and he hated that smell. But the man seemed to enjoy it. And the girl was just happy for the sun. "What happened?" asked the boy. "Clear cuts," said the man. "Lumber. It looks like a graveyard." The two looked around at the acres of clearing. Up and down on either side of the road they stood, the bald dead banks lay strewn with slash, and the great rounds of Douglas firs dotted the mud, each stump sticking out from the earth as a headstone to the giant that stood, the age of death written in its rings. The man nodded in vague agreement. "Yeah," he said, "I guess it does." Then he sat atop a stump and lit a smoke, flicking his ash out on the wind, while the boy looked on with great perplexity. They stayed here a while, and soon the child wandered off to pee, and when he had finally made it just out of view, the man held his hand out flat before him and watched it as it trembled. Enough to feel it, enough to notice. He could feel it in his chest and in his knees and down his back. In every muscle a tremor in his stillness, every pore prickling with sweat, every droplet stinking. He turned on his stump away from the direction of his child, and from his coat's inner pocket fished the plastic pint bottle into his lap and unscrewed the cap. He sat with it a moment, swallowed in its smell. He felt like retching, but he held his breath and took 3 large pulls and gagged and spat and drank again, and heaved and sweat and tucked it away and turned around again, that old smiling dog looking up at him as she panted in her light. All day they walked. For her they did. It was evening when they had come to the crest. They made their place in the mud against a stone, and the man pulled from the wagon the jug of water and the dusty can of pork and beans. He popped the jug with his thumb and had a swig, and popped the bean lid with his slip joint and held it to the child. The child shook his head. "You need to eat something today." The boy said nothing, crouched before his dog, dragging his fingers along her coat and watching the strands of fur carry off on the air. The man took a swig of beans and belched, and soon all three of them sat quietly as they looked out from atop the hill, at all those trees that went on forever beneath them, that rolling sea of endless green that crawled its way to the very rim of that very world where life and death and all its substance shrinks to nothing in the vastness of it all. To their left, the meadow lay just around 200 yards below, and they could see their town on the horizon. Just barely. Only its two largest buildings that stuck out from the trees. It was the hospital on the north side of town and the jail in the south. The man looked over at the boy and his dog, and down at the meadow, and at everything that surrounded. He couldn't think of a prettier place to die. "I think she is feeling better, Dad." The man smiled, not with his mouth but with his eyes. And in the west before them, the sun now hung 4 steady fingers above that little town, and the strands of lichen that bearded the trees shimmered in its light and blew on the air, and off in the woods a woodpecker hammered, and down below them, out from the break, Adu and her fawn stepped onto the trail, but the man had coughed and scared them away. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve and lit a smoke. "Should we see if she wants her steak now?" asked the boy. The man held out the one half of a can of beans. "Eat something first. I am not hungry. You need to eat, but I am not hungry." He set the can on the ground between them and nodded. Not to the boy, but to himself. "Okay," he whispered. "It is okay." He held the cigarette in his teeth, his eyes half closed to the smoke, while he pulled the ribeye from his coat pocket and peeled it from its cling wrap. Cold and stiff. He gave it to the boy, and the boy dangled it before her. She sniffed it and turned away. The man then rose and knelt behind his boy and took him in his arms. He took the steak from those little hands and held it again before her. The girl turned away, and so he kissed the back of his child's head and set the steak aside with the beans. He held the child in an arm and pointed at the meadow. "You see that tree down there?" The child nodded. He could smell the fire on his breath. "I want you to go and wait for us there. You stay right there until we come." "Why?" "You just go and you wait. Understand?" The child nodded. The man took the elephant from the wagon and gave it to the boy. "You hold on to this for her, okay? Can you do that for her?" The child nodded, and to this the man put his lips to the back of his head again. The smell of it. Then he let go of his boy, and the boy set off for the tree. "Don't you want to say goodbye to her?" The child stopped without a word. "Solomon?" He turned to face his father, and only his father. His little fists balled beside him, and his little face red and swollen, holding his breath to keep hold of his tears. "Do you want to say goodbye to her?" The boy let go of his breath, and a sob slipped with it, and so he held it again and shook his head, keeping his eyes high away from hers. His father nodded. "Okay. It's okay." And so the child turned and made down the hill, those stuttering little breaths carrying with him. The man and the dog stayed on that hill, looking out across their world, the jail and the hospital, the hundreds of miles of woodland and the child within it. The man could see him down there gathering her flowers, a little ball of light in his shining yellow coat moving among the grass. The girl had begun to whimper again, and he offered her the steak, but she groaned and turned her face away. The man nodded, and together they watched in that final hour the sun slip lower and it all dim further from a sea of green to a world of black where the lights of town had begun to flicker out from the dark, much like the stars. He took her out from the wagon in her soiled, wet blanket and onto his lap, where he cradled her in the mud and kissed her and thanked her for everything, waiting for the last reach of sun to finally recede and for it all to fade so that he could give her every precious moment, so that he could give her all the light he could. He covered her up with the blanket and buried her, the child sitting against the rotten maple tree with his head in his knees, crying her name until his tired voice could hardly whisper. The man scooped him up and carried him off into the grass and towards the tree line, and the child watched over his father's shoulder the clearing fade with the distance of their lantern and the flowers he'd picked and that little stuffed elephant he'd left in the mud, swallowed slowly by the darkness. The man left the wagon where it was beside the stone and carried his boy down the trail in the bare and soundless dark, with all but the short, soft reach of the dying lantern for guidance and his frozen breath that rose against it. "Is she in heaven?" spoke the child. The man was quiet a moment before he could answer. "Yes." "And she is with Mama now?" "Yes, she's with Mama now." The boy fell quiet again for a long time. The man thought he had fallen asleep. Then he spoke. "Is that what Mama looked like?" The man bit his lip, and his throat trembled, same as the rest of him, his sweat falling and stinking, and his voice cracking through his teeth. "No," he said. The boy lay curled asleep in the passenger seat with his head propped up against the door, the old girl's fur left there in the seat between them. The man studied his child, that delicate innocence illuminated in the brief reflections of their high beams, and sometimes he wondered just how he was his blood unworthy of that beautiful child that was made to carry it, a heart befouled by it. The man could feel the guilt he held in his. With every pump of it, it was there, with every beat that kicked along, and he hoped that one day the child could forgive him, and he hoped that one day he would understand. The boy's foot twitched, and he whined briefly in his dreaming, and the man wondered if the child would cry the same for him in the end. Deep down, he hoped that he would, or maybe it was selfish to think this way, and although he knew that there wasn't a heaven, sometimes he liked to think that there was. And so he waved at the sky, and he hoped there was someone up there who could see him, and he hoped that she was waving too.